Hi and welcome to this video where we've made a bit more progress. I've now added the bumper carrier, the radiators back in, the rest of the wiring looms back on, and I've also put the drive shafts back in as well. Ended with a bit of a disaster there, and the results are still coming out, which was don't try and put your gearbox oil in when the engine's up in the air, because it won't go in. And I did include the video for that. I was thinking perhaps I should admit it because it was a bit of a disaster, but then I thought, well, I've made a mistake, I'll include it. So I've still got to get all the oil back in the gearbox yet, but didn't want to leave it out and forget. But yeah, you'll see that at the end of the video. But anyway, so hopefully you'll enjoy this video, and as usual, many thanks for watching. Thank you.
So it's probably best we take a look at the wiring loom before laying it into position. So here's a labelled photograph showing all the many connectors that we now need to connect up. So you may wish to pause it to have a look at this in more detail. So what I'll do now is to lay the wiring loom around the engine, and this gives us a rough placement of where the connection's going to go. So if I lay the main plastic conduits down on top of the engine, we've obviously got the 4 connectors there that all go to the fuel injectors. So I'll just get those in sort of position because they're quite tight. The wires are quite short on those. And this one is a nice easy one. That just goes to the back, to the coil pack, and that's for our spark plugs. So that one's out the way there. So we've got one round here. Now this one goes to the alternator extension lead. This part's broken on mine, but we'll get that into position like so. And then we've got the T-map connector here that goes to the inlet manifold. Pop that in there, and we've obviously got the wire there hovering around for the throttle body. We pop that one in, and then we've got the longer trailing wire which went to the knock sensor, so we'll pop that one in its position. And then we've got another long one at the front here where I've actually got a bare connector which goes to the air conditioning, which I don't have. So this one goes down for the crankshaft position sensor. And that's got a little red locking tab as well. Pop that on. So I will need to put a little bit of tape, I think, on this bare connector. It's not great to have loose fraying wires around. So we'll tidy that up. Right, so we can now come back up to the engine. So this is the reverse connector that goes on top of the gearbox. We've just got to feed it down there. I'm trying to work out which way to go, whether to go to the left of that or to the right. I'm opting for the right. So that switches on our reversing lights when we pop it into reverse gear. Now this one here is for the coolant temperature. We've got to tuck that down the bottom there. It's quite busy down there. And the other wire that's left there is going to go to the O2 sensor when we put the exhaust back on. So then we've also got this pipe now that we can pop in, which is going to the servo, the brake servo, and that then goes into the inlet manifold and gives that servo a vacuum. So you have to pull the little red tab up and that slots in. Now coming over to the other side of the engine, we've got the camshaft position sensor, And again, that's got a little red locking tab. So just put that into position and push the little tab over, like so. And I'll just tighten this fuse box using an 8mm socket. We've also got a wire to go inside that, a multiple connector. So we'll pop that in now. So there's that multiple connector block. It's quite difficult to remember which way all the wires went when you come back to it after many weeks. Hopefully it's all going back correctly. There's a little rubber weather shield grommet there, and we've got to make sure that's in position correctly so water doesn't get into it. And now we can go on to the fuel pipe to the rail. So we can take our fuel pipe now back over, and it just goes in there. I've just put a little red cover on that just to stop any dirt getting inside there while I was working on the engine, and this just simply pushes on like so. So we do need to put that into a little bracket there. So there's a 10mm little bolt there that needs to go back in onto the engine mount. So there's two pipes there, clip in, and then just tighten that with the 10mm socket, and that's done. So now we can install the drive belt for the alternator and the coolant pump, and possibly air conditioning if fitted. Right, so I'm going to be using the Laser 4770 kit, which has got both of the tools for the supercharged version as well. Obviously, sadly, I can't use that one because I haven't got a supercharged mini. But anyway, so we pop our tool into that, and now we can lift it up and simply pop our securing pin in. So with many hands, we can slot that in like so, so we can get the belt on. So it's quite a simple procedure, especially on this one where there's no air conditioning. I mean, you couldn't really get any simpler than this. So I did try putting it on the alternator part first, and then obviously struggled to get it onto the main crank. So you might find it easier to pop it on the crank and the coolant pump, and then finally pop it onto the alternator. So if you've got air conditioning, you'd obviously have an extra pulley as well. So make sure that's all nicely lined up and it's sat inside the grooves, and then we can just release the tension like so and pop our pin out. So that's our drive belt nicely back on. So with that done, we can now go on to refitting the modular front end that houses the radiators. Obviously there's only one radiator in my car. So just lifting that up nice and simply, just checking there's our alignment for the bottom hose and the top hose on the left as well, and just one connector. So to make life a little bit easier, what I'm going to do is pop in a couple of M8 bolt threads like so with a nut on the end, and then this means I can move this modular section backwards and forwards without it falling on the floor or having to hold it. So that makes life a lot easier. So we can just pull it forward now and easily reconnect our hoses. But before I do that, I'm going to connect the power supply to the cooling fan. That just pops on, and there is a little clip there that also clips the cable to the fan housing so it doesn't get caught in the blades and chops itself off. So now we can reconnect the top and the bottom radiator hoses. So with our bolts in position, it's a lot easier now just to pull this forward. I have smeared the inside of the hoses with a little bit of red rubber grease, a very thin smear. I might add, just to ease the pipes going on and hopefully make them easier to come off in the future. So I'm just going to use my little favourite tool here just to get this bottom hose into position, get that clamped up. It's quite a useful tool, that. It does sort of buy you time to get it into the position you want before having to release it. And then we just got the top one to do. Drop that in nicely. Notice there that we've got a bleed screw there to the left, which we'll need to undo when we come to refill the cooling system. So we can reconnect the fuel tank venting valve with its pipes and electrical connections now. So this is the little vent valve. So there is an electrical connector there at the bottom. Pop that on. And then we've also got the pipe work, which is quite rigid, so you can't get that wrong. So pop those on top and bottom. We then need to use a pair of pliers just to lock that in position, like so. Right then. So now we can reconnect the earth strap next to it. So just take the nut off there. Now it's worth actually giving this a little bit of a clean before we pop it back on. Obviously I'm not going to clean it too much because then I'd have to re-tin it again. So we can get that in position and tighten that with a 13mm socket. I'm not actually sure of the torque. If I find out, I'll put it in the description below. So we can now go on to fitting the two subframe cross tubes, but don't tighten them first like I did, as you need the aluminium bumper carrier on first. So you'll notice that as these go on, the subframe has got two holes there that are elongated to allow these cross tubes to actually move backwards and forwards, and you'll see why when you come to fit the bumper carrier. Now it is a 16mm socket and they are torqued to 100 Newton meters, but I advise you hold fire for the moment. So don't tighten them just yet, because when you come to put the carrier on, those two bolt threads at the end of these cross tubes may not line up. So you want them loose so that carrier can be fitted first. So I am going to have to loosen these in a moment. Like I say, so here is your torque setting. It's 100 Newton meters for when you do tighten them. Okay, so let's reconnect the horns. So I've taken the horn actually off just to show the connectors, so you can see that one doesn't fit. So that's the lighting one, and that one does. So that's our correct connector, which is that one there. So I took the horn off with a Torx 25, but obviously you don't need to take the horn off. That was just to show in the video. So I'll pop the connector back on again, like so, and then obviously I best put my horn back on. And there is obviously the other one on the other side, which I'm leaving on the car. So that's that one back in. So onto the other side. So we've got a temperature sensor there that comes through. That's the air temperature sensor. So you've got to be a bit careful with that. So we've got the lighting ones there, and then the short one is for the horn. And pop that into position. So that coolant one has to be fed through the outer bumper carrier. So we've also got a bolt that needs to go back in using a 10mm socket that goes onto the cross tube. Unfortunately on the other side it's broken, so I can only put one back in, like so. And then we can remove the two M8 bolt threads as we don't need them now. So we can now refit the aluminium bumper carrier, and hopefully you didn't tighten those cross tube bolts just yet. So if you do tighten those bolts like I did, this is what happens. You put the carrier on and possibly will find that the two cross tube bolts won't go through. So you'll have to now loosen those back off. So we'll quickly do that. So we've got plenty of movement. Yep, nice and wobbly. Do the other side. So they're made to actually have some movement in for this fitment. So now our bumper carrier goes on lovely, like so. So we can now put all the nuts back on. I think it's 4 on each side. And it might be worth actually putting the Torx threads in as well, that you can see at the top right there and the top left on this picture, because the bumper goes through those and they could also be done with being lined up first. I'll show you that in a moment. So I'll just spin these all on with an air ratchet. So you do need a deep socket for the inner ones, and they're all going to be tightened to 22 Newton meters, like so. And then what we can do is feed the air temperature sensor through so it's ready to go on the outer bumper when we get to that stage. So what you can now do is tighten those 4 bolts underneath to 100 Newton meters with a 16mm socket. Now I am going to check those 2 bolt holes at the top where the outer bumper fixes, and like I say, it's probably worth actually putting those in as well at the same time so you know that they're going to go in and not jam. So now on to refitting the drive shafts, and you should use a new spring clip on the left drive shaft, and also note that the 2 nuts must also be replaced. So there's our 2 drive shafts laid out ready. So these nuts I'm taking off now, those must be replaced with new ones. I will be reusing them, but in reality you shouldn't. So you'll notice on the left hand drive shaft there is that metal spring clip there, and that also needs to be replaced. And again, I'm obviously not replacing it because this is just like a demo car, but I think it might have made life a little bit harder getting the drive shaft in. So I'm just going to remove the 3 bolts there with a 13mm socket, and that's for the intermediate bearing. So I'm going to get the shorter drive shaft in first on the left. Now you do need to be very careful not to damage the rubber seals that are on the gearbox. So you do need to try and put this in carefully. So I've actually ended up putting a bit of molly grease on the end there because I couldn't get this in. You do need to sort of give it a bit of a smack. There you go. And it sort of clicked in. So that might be what the little spring clip's for. You've got to push that into position. And then I'm just going to put a bit of molly grease onto the splines. Obviously not the bolt threads. Obviously don't want to grease those. And then very carefully get it into position. Now I've still got the ABS sensors in position because I couldn't get them out. So you don't want to damage those either as you put this back together. Right, so then I've got to put the lower ball joint back on. And I have put a little bit of copper slip on there just to make removal in the future perhaps a little bit easier. Now I also put the track rod end on, but sadly forgot to press record on the camera. So it's now in position. So I'm putting the big nut on there. So onto the right drive shaft now. So basically the same procedure. Again, I'm just going to put a little bit of moly grease on there to help things slide in. So this one's a little bit trickier because you have got the intermediate bearing, which you need to line the bracket up against the back of the engine. Now, notice that I actually had it facing the wrong way, which then made things a little bit tricky to rotate that bracket around. So this side went in quite nicely. So it's just that bracket there that I'm trying to now spin to face the back of the engine. Like so. So again, I'm going to put a little bit of moly grease on the splines, not the thread though. I'll just get that into position, into the hub. So I'll bring the camera around now so you can actually see in there. So line that up and out it pops. So remember, you must use new nuts. These are the old nuts I'm using, but you must use new ones. And then I've just got to get those 3 bolts back in using a 13mm socket that hold the intermediate bearing. So you might find a deep socket is easier for this, especially when you get to the bits just above the drive shaft. And then we need to tighten those to 25 Newton meters. Go back on with the deep socket, like so, and then we need to just pop round to the other side. Now you can use a shallow socket, just tighten that up. So I'm just going to wipe the lower ball joint, make sure there's no dust on there. And again, I'm just putting a little bit of copper slip on. It doesn't say to do that, so you may wish to not do that. So we can just pop that in. Again, new nuts must be actually used on all these items here. So this one on here should be a new nut. And on the track rod ends of the steering, those should be new nuts as well. So again, remember to use a new nut on this part. So I think anywhere where there's a safety critical item, you should use new. So the track rod end is tightened to 52 Newton meters. Now for me it was either a 15 or a 17mm socket. This side was actually a 15 and the other side was a 17, so obviously aftermarket track rod ends. So we've got our click there. The bottle jack makes life a lot easier. It does sort of make sure it's pinched in nice and tight while you tighten that up. Right, so go back round to the other side, and again track rod ends with a new nut, and then we can torque that to 52 Newton meters. And finally we've got the lower ball joint, which is torqued to 56 Newton meters using an 18mm socket. And finally the other side. Again, new nuts must be used on all of these items for safety reasons. So now the big nuts, they're 182 Newton meters, and you do need a big 32mm socket. So that's going to spin around, so you either have somebody hold the brake pedal down for you or somehow lock it in position. So I found this method seemed to work for me, which was just to jam the vented disc against the brake. I'm just going to double check that I've definitely got that torque correct. Yep. And we are going to need to fold the end over on here. We'll call it stake or peening the end. So this is to obviously make sure that nut doesn't come loose at all. So we can now go onto the other side and do the same. So just showing you there that it's going to spin if you don't have somebody put their foot on the brake. So locking the vented disc does seem to work quite nicely. There's our click. Give it another check, just make sure. And then we need to peen this side as well. So obviously the risk of using the old nuts is when you come to peen it like this, it's going to be a lot weaker since it's already been hit once, undone, and then you're hitting it again. Probably the reason to use new nuts here. So don't forget to refill the gearbox with the oil, but don't do it with the front of the car in the air like I did, unless you like an oily challenge. So it is a 17mm socket for the oil filler and the drain plug. Various different torques though. So this is what I was using because I thought this would be a brilliant idea. I've got the oil, I know it's got to go back in, and I don't want to waste any. So I could have used the pressure bleeder as shown in here, but I thought I'll have some wastage within the pressure bleeder. So this method is guaranteed that every drop I got out will go back in. And how wrong I was on that. So I think this part probably needs to be left till the car's actually all put back together and back on the ground. But I was a bit worried that I would forget about the oil, so I thought I'd try and get it in at this point. And what a disaster. So as you can see, it's actually getting ready to pour out on me. So let's get it all in there. Let's make sure it's all in there. You'd actually probably use clean oil as well. This is obviously, as you'll see in the bottom of the jug, it's still got some sediment in there. So ideally you would use new oil. Alright, so let's get ready. Got the drain plug ready. And chaos begin. Here we go. I couldn't find the hole, because there's actually another hole underneath that that's almost the same size. Damn. So there's the oil going, it's heading for the tarmac. Quick, stop it. What happened there? Yeah, what happened there? Complete disaster. Absolutely oil everywhere. So bang go my plan to not waste any oil. Looks like I might be buying some new oil for this gearbox after all. So, okay, let's try the engine oil. Surely that will work. Okay, so again I'm putting the oil, well, it's less than a year old, this oil, and I suppose it hasn't actually done any mileage, so in theory it should be quite clean. But again, to my surprise, at the bottom of the container was a nice black sediment. So this was actually clean oil less than a year ago, and I think I've probably only done about 3,000 miles, if that. And yet I'm fascinated by this. You can see that. I'm thinking, why is there this sediment? So it does make you wonder what the bottom of the sump must look like, if that's what it looks like after just a few weeks sat in a container. But anyway, so the oil is in the engine. So we had some success in the end with oil. So you've been watching Fitting the Wiring, Radiator and Drive Shafts. And thank you for watching, and I hope this video helps you refit your Mini R50 engine back into the car. This video was filmed and edited by me, Mark Savage, in September 2021, and I can be found on Instagram and Facebook under Coats and Gators.